Hello, I'm Magdalena Ball, and I would like to begin by acknowledging that I am on the lands of the Awabakal people and pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging. I am so delighted today to be chatting with editor and author Nicola Redhouse about her fantastic book, Unlike the Heart, which was released last year by the University of Queensland Press. Nicola, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming back to talk to me. We had a panel not too long ago for the Newcastle Writers Festival, and it was so good and so interesting that I promised online that I would have everybody back for a one-on-one because I think we really just grazed the surface in that session, and it just felt like there was so much more to talk about. And I really wanted to get into the nitty-gritty of each individual book. And I particularly want to get into the nitty-gritty of your book today because it's so interesting and so such an unusual and evocative take on, I guess, what was a difficult time. But before we begin chatting, can I ask you to just open the show by reading a little from the book so people can get a sense, just a little bit of a sense of your style?
Sure, yeah. I'm going to read a section from midway through the book, which is about the time that my father hypnotized me. My father, Aaron, had once reluctantly hypnotized me. As a teenager, thrilled by the discovery that he had been trained in hypnosis at university, I'd convinced him to try it on me. I lay with the reverence of one about to be sacrificed for the higher good. On the bed, Aaron and his partner Paul kept pretty for me in my bedroom away from home, the evaporative air conditioning barely diluting the heat of that Western Australian summer. Aaron held a pencil above me, its tip hovering in the air. I was to look at the dot of its lead point as steadily as I could. He brought it down slowly. He instructed me in a low, even voice to relax, to keep my eyes on the pencil, let my lids get heavy. Hypnosis relies on the subject's willingness to participate, and my father could not have found himself a more suggestible subject. My arm levitated on his instruction, my fingers numbed when he told them to. Do you remember that? I asked him now. He laughed. You begged me. I can't believe I did it. He was ashamed of the showman connotations of hypnosis after all these years. It's not something I do in my work, he'd said every time I'd nagged him to try it on me. I remembered my arm, inhabited of its own will, and how it had lowered itself back to its position beside me on the bed, and how my father had instructed in his somnolent bass that it would begin to go numb, and how it had. When he had approached it with a sewing needle, I'd not flinched. Didn't you stick a pin in my arm? I asked him now. He looked surprised. Yes, I remember that. The pin thing was to reinforce and confirm the suggestion I'd made to you that your arm was numb. Don't forget, the method of hypnosis I was doing is based on an idea of accessing the unconscious mind through suggestion. Back in the 1970s, before Aaron had moved on to his eventual interest in psychoanalytic therapy, he was completing his master's in psychology and had been trained in a kind of hypnosis called Ericksonian Hypnosis, which uses a technique known as paradoxical communication. Milton Erickson, after whom it was named, was a maverick, prone to adopting rather offbeat strategies in his work with patients to engage what he deemed to be the patient's unconscious mind. He believed that in a deep trance, people have entered a state in which they are responding from a part of their minds that they're not aware of, an unconscious part. But his concept of the unconscious was nothing like Freud's hostile construction of self that banished unacceptable thoughts. Erickson said it was a healing force that could effectively produce change if communicated to indirectly or using metaphor, language, play, and storytelling rather than authoritative command. His prediction was that the person would resist overt direction, but their unconscious mind could be influenced. And I think you also told me it wouldn't bleed, I continued, eager to get to the part that interested me before our time was up. He looked perplexed. Something about it not bleeding rings a bell, but no, I would have maybe told you that it wasn't going to bleed because I wasn't putting it in very deeply. I said it to you so you wouldn't worry. I wasn't saying the hypnosis would stop it bleeding. Oh, I said. Aaron looked at me askance. Let's make some time to talk about this. I have to get back to my rooms, he said, wrestling with Noah from the high chair and holding him high so that Noah let out a joyful squeal.
I can't recall, did you make some time to talk about it later, or is that the extent of the conversation you had with your dad?
About hypnosis?
Yeah, and about that particular session.
Oh gosh, it's still something I talk to him about. He's getting rather sick of it. I'm still completely obsessed with hypnosis and what happens and understanding it. Yeah. In the book, did I write about it more? No, I went on to the next part of that scene is me phoning my sister to verify her experience of what had happened, which was quite different.
Yeah. And would you say, I mean, do you think, having grown up in that household, I imagine, and it comes through in the book too, that the influences are subtle and continuous, but nevertheless, was that a point, the point at which your father hypnotized you, that, you know, you maybe some spark of fascination began?
Oh gosh, no, it was long before that, because that hypnosis scene was in my teens. But I'd become interested in my father's work from, you know, I suppose as soon as I could comprehend what he did for his work, or even before that, when I just started to sort of absorb it. So he was working as a psychoanalytic psychotherapist, and he had his consulting rooms adjoined to his house. He was by that stage, my parents had divorced when I was a baby already, so I didn't live with him. But when I visited him, which was almost every day after school and on weekends, when he was working, I would sort of watch and sort of observe that people were coming to see him, and I asked him about his work. And he also had a radio show on one of the commercial radio stations in South Africa, which is where this early childhood part of the story, of my story, took place. He had a radio show where he would take calls. People would call. There'd be a theme every week, and he would sort of answer questions in this psychotic mode. So one week the theme was dreams, and people would call in with their dreams. And I was just absolutely fascinated by what he did. I just spent all my, I just wanted to know about how it worked. And then, when I got a bit older, started reading the books that he had on his shelves and that sort of thing. And it was also, very much a part of my mother's language and way of understanding. She had been heavily influenced by Luria, who I talk about in my book, and his work in understanding the brain as not localized, brain function as not localized, in her work in the health sciences. And also, as I write about, extensively in the book, she'd been heavily influenced by Freud and psychoanalytic thinking in her childhood and teen years.
And interestingly, you didn't actually go into that field specifically. I mean, although a lot of your work pivots around those scientific subjects, you didn't go into psychiatry, psychology.
No. Well, I sort of have had an allergic reaction to science, in the sense of, science is a method. It's such a broad term, but when I say an allergic reaction, my mind would shut down in high school when it came to the sciences. I was interested in the arts. I was interested in, I glazed over in, physics and that sort of thing. And maybe it took me a long time to recognize that what I was interested in my father's and my mother's work had this intense crossover in science. And as I grew up, but I'm talking about in my adulthood, as I began to sort of read more widely, I started to understand that my kind of pulling away from science was a bit of an anxiety in itself. That actually, I'm just fascinated now with anything that has that crossover with human experience and scientific endeavor. But no, I wasn't interested in going into that kind of work. I wanted to work with anything that involved writing, basically.
Yeah. And I'm finding this more and more. It really is quite interesting to see how the arts and the sciences not only can interact, but need to interact. That some of the most critical exegesis, if you like, or writings that I've come across in the past, say, 10 years have all come from arts intersecting with science, not straight science, probably because of my own limitations as well. But it's, really interesting to me to see how for example, the way you explore psychology in Unlike the Heart is quite important, as important as, for example, a clinical study or have somebody within the field would study it.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot to be said about modes of scientific communication or language. And I know there are a lot of efforts that are made, continue to be made, for sort of better science communication. Not to say that science communication is inherently bad, but that there's some sort of acknowledgement that there's a deficit that comes into play with the language. And you know, one of the things I talk about in the book is not about the language of scientific endeavor for the layperson so much. Well, there is that, but there's also the tensions that arise with scientific language within its own fields and fields that come up against each other. So one of the things that I really encountered in my own research, because I was looking into these two sort of disparate but connected fields of, you know, psychiatry, psychology, medicine, the mind, brain, these two kind of paradigms that supposedly exist on different planes, is the fact that in a lot of instances, I want to use the word headway, but it seems wrong when I'm talking about the mind and brain, but I will. Headway is not, there's an impasse when it comes to language, that often different fields are talking about the same thing, but using different terminology, or using the same terminology, but in completely different ways. And somehow that is quite problematic in bringing together what could be a shared knowledge. So the field that I became very interested in, because it directly addresses the questions I was asking in the book, is Neuro Psychoanalysis, which is this field that was founded by Professor Mark Soames in South Africa, which essentially is saying, you know, psychoanalysis has studied the brain as subject and neuroscience has studied the brain as object, but the mind as subject, and neuroscience has studied the brain as object, but really we're talking about the same thing. How can we unite that knowledge? And that's what's so appealing to me about that field. And when I went to the Congress that they held in Amsterdam in 2015, it was just remarkable to see these different, you know, these people from these different fields coming together, neuroscientists, psychoanalysts, in one room, listening to each other talk in these different languages and kind of not being resistant to it.
Yeah, I think making those connections is a critical thing, and maybe it does sometimes take somebody who's not in either of those fields to make that that bridge between them.
Yes, I feel that. I mean, I'm often I'll be reading sort of well, even just recently. I mean, I'm not the first to make any of these connections, and as often when I make a connection, I'll then research it and find that plenty of other people have. But just as a sort of example, I was reading about the neuroscientist Michael Gazzaniga's work on what he calls now I've forgotten the term, but he has a term for the way that we sort of explain things, gaps in sort of, you know, how we explain how one thing, when there's something missing in our understanding of something. And then in other fields of neuroscience, that the word confabulation is used for that. So I was reading Gazzaniga's paper and thinking, but that's what, you know, so-and-so talks about when they talk about confabulation. Then I Googled the two terms, and someone had written a paper explaining how and why these two ideas cross over. So yeah, it is interesting as a kind of lay person to come in and have that overview.
Yes. And of course, as you do in your book, to also do that with, you know, with your own journey and your own memoir. And to bring all that together, so that you know, there is so much information in this book. It's very much a piece of science writing in many respects, but of course there's also the pain and the working through the pain, the actual you know, postnatal depression that you went through. And did you feel, I mean, you began with that, of course, but did you feel that the work kept growing into something that was much, much bigger than your own particular story?
Yeah, absolutely. It had started with this interest in the question of whether Freud's theory of the unconscious had any validity in the world of science, because my sister had posed that challenge to me. And then over time, you know, I realized it was attached to this story of postnatal anxiety, as I call it, that I had. and as I kind of started adding the layers of questions really onto it, that's, as you know, it expanded outwards and outwards. And then of course, you know, just the experience of postnatal anxiety in itself then opens up so many other questions about mental experience. So even, you know, when I was trying to kind of connect, so I would try and like find something in a research, say, about the genetics of postnatal depression, and then I would find that really there hadn't been that many papers definitively on postnatal depression, but it expanded outward to depression. So then it kind of referred you to those papers on depression more broadly. So then the book ends up opening up, because it's not just about postnatal depression, it's about depression as a phenomenon. And it just kept, and there were times when it was, you know, unwieldy, and I felt like a little bit alarmed at where it could go. And right near the start, when I started the more sort of theoretical question about Freud, there was a period of time where I thought I was writing a book about the authority of science. But I didn't feel, that felt too big for me, and I felt completely at sea. So yeah, it does and did expand, and I hope it does for readers too. I mean, I know it's very much been received as a kind of product, so to speak, crudely, as a postnatal depression memoir. I don't see it as that, and I kind of, I hope that it opens up, that it can be kind of, that other people might try it. You know, I see it in the library sometimes under the it's in the parenting area, and I kind of, I think it would be of a lot of use, and I've had a lot of mothers write to me about it, and I'm really glad about that, but I hope it's more as well.
Of course, yes. And there are so many other strands that come through too. I mean, there's the whole genetic inheritance and epigenetics that, you know, that you explore in there. And I feel in some ways, and that there's almost like a transcending of the negative, in that you have your own pain, but also it's kind of linked, almost like being part of mishpucha. You know, it's kind of linked to your mother and your grandmother, and that there's this sense that there's this, you know, negative as it is, there's this sense of this genetic strand that connects all of you in a way that's almost kind of beautiful as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, you know, the ways that things have kind of, I think I put it in the book, ricocheted down the family line, or the threads, you know, that became more and more obvious to me as I researched and talked to my mother, and that, you know, you sort of have these kind of senses of things in your family that are maybe not quite, they're kind of inarticulable in a way, like just I talk about having the sense of my mother free falling, that that somehow she didn't, even though I knew my grandmother, and I experienced her as very loving, there was something that I had sensed as being, that my mother wasn't held, or something within her orbit or something, you know. And so then talking more to my mother, and then having that kind of, you know, that real, like, crashing realization that yes, that's a sense that was really real. My mother actually had overwhelming separation anxiety as a child, that her mother had an undiagnosed postnatal psychosis, that was something real that wasn't, and now that explains my feeling about that. So writing it definitely kind of helped me follow those threads through and understand them better.
Yes. And also that, just even that being overwhelmed by love sensation, you know, that sense of, you know, caring so intensely about your child. I mean, I guess any mother can recognize that, that sense of, you know, terror love, if you like.
Yeah. Is there any other kind when it comes to children?
That's right.
Yeah. It should be called terror love. I terror love you. Yeah, I know. It's that kind of love where you're yelling at them because you don't want them to injure themselves.
Yes.
Yeah.
But also, you know, it's tied up with that whole separation anxiety sensation.
Yeah.
And the sense that you now understand something, you're now connected in some way, or understand something about your mother and your grandmother that you couldn't have before you went through this pain. It's a
yes. absolutely. I mean, that experience of understanding the way that a kind of healthy separation occurs between mother and baby, and how and what that might feel like if it doesn't occur, that became so clear to me, not just in the writing of the book. Obviously, part of what I write about in the book is my own experience in psychoanalytic psychotherapy. That's what that experience has given me, that understanding of the implications of that separation and how it can happen. And I was going to quote, there's a really great line from Jesse Greengrass's book Sight, and I know I'm not going to get it right, I won't remember it, but it's just wonderful. It's about how that sort of realization of looking at her child and the realization that her job now was to let her child go away from her safely. But I think that and you know, that in some sense was the center of my anxiety the moment I had a baby, was suddenly realizing that I had to reckon with this really awfully difficult letting go gradually. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, I also feel like the final section of the book, it's almost a point of a kind of healing, not just for you, but you know, your parents. Almost a way of saying, look, whatever we did, you know, the mistakes we made, the pain we went through, our flaws, this is a kind of it's we're healed. We can move beyond this, and that healing is also passed on to the reader. That, you know, it is in this complexity and in these struggles that we have that, you know, that make us who we are.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, there's a kind of idea in psychoanalytic work that part of what you're doing is coming to terms with reality, that you can't mourn until you come to terms with reality. And I think that's what I see it as, more so than maybe even healing. That healing implies in a way that you have recovered, or that the things have gone away, but there's something about, I mean, we see it in grief and grieving as well, you know, coming to terms with the reality. As long as we push a reality away, we can never do the grieving we need to do. So I think that the book actually was really helpful in my family as that kind of artifact of everyone coming to terms with certain things, and sort of, I mean, you know, it's not everyone's story that they write is going, you know, there are things in my book that people in my family remembered differently, or like, you know, there's a moment in the book that I talk early on in one of the early chapters about this really seminal memory for me of being at kindergarten, and a little girl coming up to me and saying to me, your father loves me more than he loves you, which I then, on being collected from kindergarten by my father, he explained to me that she in fact was a patient of his, and that had impacted on me a lot, and it was a memory that I never let go of. Definitely, because I had this sort of lingering feeling in myself of questioning about my father's love, because he'd left when I was a baby, and that had been so seminal for me, that memory. And then sort of towards the end of the book, I write about how my sister came to me towards the end of the writing of the book in a conversation and raised that same memory, but she said it was hers. She said, remember the time that little girl came up to me and told me that she loved, that dad loved her more than she loved me. I mean, I was absolutely floored. I couldn't believe it. But, you know, so I guess what I'm saying is my writing of this book is my version of things. It's not necessarily what we have to accept as reality and coming to terms with reality, but it has been that in my family, and it's been very helpful.
Yes, and I guess even accepting that, you know, there is no one truth. There's multiplicity, and there's no, you know, yes. There is even everything that you describe is, you know, I think you allow this in the book, in the writing style as well. And I think it seems to me that complexity is part of what you were working with, that you were allowing that to be there, that, you know, that can be
comes through.
multiple truths. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you did mention in your Feminist Writers Festival Q&A that many men struggle to recognize the immense richness and complexity and crossover with science and industry and history and pretty much the whole entire existence of everything that living is bound up with. Are you still finding that most of your readers are female? Is that partially because the book is on the, the postnatal anxiety or depression shelf?
It's hard to judge who your readers are. If we're talking about, who I see at writers' festivals, it's primarily women, but that's a trend overall about writers' festivals that I think we all recognise. So I can't say for sure. I've had a lot of, interviewees and readers who have been men very interested in it. I do find that depending on how it is pitched, that skews. So I definitely find that when it is, so say I'm doing an event where it's pitched as a postnatal story, or tied up to my experience of motherhood, I find there's a bigger proponent of women there. Whereas if it's about the psyche-soma divide, or Freud, then there's a few more men. I definitely find that, without a doubt. Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So it's been about a year now since the book has come out. Have you been surprised at the reception or the way people are interpreting it, or?
Oh gosh, I've been pleasantly surprised. It's so terribly, overwhelmingly, it's such a vulnerable position to be in, to write a memoir, but a memoir that is, really so personal. That said, there's a lot that isn't in this book, believe it or not. But so yeah, I had a lot of work published before, but not, a book, and I was used to getting reviews here or there, and it's always a bracing experience. But overall, I've only had an absolutely wonderful reception, whether it's been from postnatal organisations who have contacted me and who I've sort of become kind of a spokesperson for, or kind of supported in some ways, to the readers who do write, which is just the most wonderful thing. I can't encourage it enough, readers, to make contact with writers, because it just is really, of all the things that you can get from this endeavour, I think that's the most wonderful and valuable. And I knew this when I wrote the book, there's always people who inevitably have a kind of instinctive recoiling from anything to do with psychoanalysis. There's this kind of assumption of kind of navel gazing, or a sort of, I don't know,
pseudoscience, your sister?
There's that as well. Yes, because of course, there's the recoiling from Freud as well, and all those things. But I can't help what reaction people will have to the book before they've read it. I hope once they've read it that they feel a bit differently. So overall, it's been really wonderful.
And you mentioned there's a lot that you haven't said in the book. Obviously about that particular period, but is there something in the cards, or you
writing wise?
Yeah.
I'm yes, I have been for a while now planning a book about something that has become so central to what we're all experiencing now, that I'm both excited and completely overwhelmed, which is on the topic of isolation. So that's, I've got a nonfiction book in the works that I guess springboards off my realization coming to the end of this book that what I was looking at was attachment, and how, and I'm just fascinated with this idea of like what attachment brings us as humans. So it will be looking at essentially what it is in the experience of attachment or disconnect and isolation that gives us our fundamental qualities of humanity, ranging from speech acquisition, language acquisition, to the effects of touch, that kind of thing. And I have a novel that I'm tentatively starting, but I can't even really articulate much what it's about yet. So on to the next things for sure.
Yeah, wonderful.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, that is all we have time for. But Nicola, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been wonderful talking to you.
Thank you, Maggie. It's always wonderful. 2 wonderful conversations. Thanks.
Thank you.